Right, so what I'll do in the limited time available to me is try to give an overview of recent developments in France, which are very interesting developments and raise some very important perspectives for the labor movement and for society as a whole. The present president, Macron, was associated with the last socialist government under President Francois Hollande. And then towards the end of that period, up until 2017, he started to distance himself from Francois Hollande, claim him to be a sort of economics expert, neither right nor left, representing the center of French politics, and that he could solve, the growing social and economic problems in the country because of his expert grasp of the workings of the economy. That was basically his sales pitch before the 2017 elections. He won those elections with a sizable majority. And since that time, rather than coming across as a center of politics figure, he's shown himself over all these years to be an implacable advocate of capitalist interests. One of the first things he did, for instance, was to abolish the wealth tax, which was a clear sign of where he stood in terms of, the gap between rich and poor. Even during the COVID crisis, he perpetuated his attacks against the health service. Tens of thousands of beds in hospitals were closed down during the COVID crisis. There's been a continual decline and underfunding of education and the public services. He's attacked pensions on a major scale, taken measures against workers' rights with attacks on the labor laws. And generally, the gap between the rich and the poor under Macron has considerably widened. His government's been racked by several corruption scandals of various ministers, and including himself. And he's given increased powers to the police, notably a sort of shoot on sight law if anyone refuses to obey a police order, like you're told to stop by the police. Under new laws, the police can open fire on you and kill you for that misdemeanor. He's introduced legislation against migrants, discriminatory legislation, and in particular passed a law which is known as the anti-separatist law, which really is a propaganda law, really stigmatizing people of the Muslim faith originally, or their families are from countries predominantly Muslim, and stigmatizing them as a sort of a potential threat of separatism within the French Republic. In other words, they're not really part of our society. They're not really part of French traditions. And, various measures were taken which instill suspicion and hatred towards that section of the population. And of course, that kind of discrimination has been a permanent feature of French politics for a very long time, and is in fact just a prolongation of the direct colonial oppression of the past. So it's not surprising that after all these years, because that goes back to 2017, Macron became extremely unpopular. And that lack of popularity was shown in the European elections last June, where Macron's party came off with just, I think it was 14.6% of the vote. And, for the presidential party, and with the advantages of having presidential power behind them, that was an absolutely lamentable score. Whereas the nationalists and racist Rassemblement National, led by Marine Le Pen, got 31.4%, so that's more than twice as much. And the left was disunited in those European elections. But if you generally sort of add up all the different formations which you could class as being to the left came away with something like 24% in that election. So that stinging defeat for Macron in the European elections led him to take a gamble, really, by dissolving the National Assembly, in other words, the French Parliament, and provoking, therefore, new legislative elections, parliamentary elections. And basically, Macron's argument was me or chaos. Vote for me and my party, or else you're going to get the extremes. And the extremes were the left and the Rassemblement National. So his argument was if you want stability, if you want institutional stability, you want to fend off the danger of the extreme left or the extreme right, then I'm your only choice. The fact is that gamble backfired seriously against Macron. There were two important consequences of that dissolution. The first one was the unification of the left. For years, the various left-wing parties, whether it be France Insoumise, which is the party led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who you might have heard of, or the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, these parties have been bickering and sort of fighting among each other for years. And any idea of any sort of national coalition or alliance between them seemed to be extremely remote. But under the shock of the results of the European elections and the dissolution of the Assembly and the new elections, which were called at very short notice, they were held in the same month as the European elections at the end of June 2024. Literally overnight, there was an all-night meeting between the various components of the left, and overnight they came to an agreement and launched this new Popular Front, as it was called. All of a sudden, these parties, which had been bickering and arguing between themselves over minor points sometimes, suddenly found that all their disagreements were relatively minor. They were all agreed on the fundamentals, and now the left must unite against the danger from the extreme right for the next elections. So that was a very positive development, actually, in my view. That didn't solve all the problems, but it certainly gave an enormous boost to morale and enthusiasm on the left, because it was clear that as long as the left was divided, as it had been before, it was just going from defeat to defeat. And the second important consequence of the dissolution were the results of the elections themselves, because here again, Macron suffered a major defeat. He came away with, I think it's 104 deputies for his party, which is something like, well, it must be less than a fifth of the National Assembly for the party which had previously been in power. The Rassemblement National got 126 deputies, and the Republican Party, which is the traditional party, going back to Chirac and further to Giscard d'Estaing, the traditional right party, and the party which was Sarkozy's party more recently, they only got 38 seats. And the new Popular Front came out as the biggest parliamentary group with 147 seats. So what we had here in the elections was a collapse of anything which you might associate with the centre, whether it be Macron or the traditional right-wing parties, and a growth in support for what Macron calls the extremes, in other words, the Rassemblement National on the right and the new Popular Front on the left. So Macron spent 2 months before he felt he could name a prime minister. So France was basically practically without government for those 2 months. It had the ministers were called resigned ministers, but they were still sort of doing their jobs. And finally, he nominated this guy, Michel Barnier, as the new prime minister. Now, the irony here is that Barnier and most of the ministers which he has now nominated for, the different posts in the government, is the party which got the least support in the elections, as I say, with just, 38 deputies out of, 5,500 deputies overall. And yet they're the ones who are forming the new government, also with representatives of Macron's party. So it's a kind of right-wing Republican Macronist coalition. But what's interesting about this situation is that government is beholden to the Rassemblement National because of the size of its parliamentary representation. Basically, unless the Rassemblement National supports this government, it could bring it down. So what Le Pen has said is that she doesn't denounce the new government which has been brought in, that they'll have a wait and see approach. And they phrased it more or less in these terms, that as long as this government carries out policies which are satisfactory to the racist and nationalist agenda of the Rassemblement National, then it can count on their support. So the basic upshot is that here we have a weak and discredited president and a very fragile coalition dependent on the Rassemblement National, on the extreme right. And, one of the things we need to discuss in relation to the present situation in the country is the high level of support for Le Penism, or for, the extreme right. After all, it's something like it's between 10 and 11 million people voted for the Rassemblement National. And this growth of nationalist, racist trends in society is not limited to France by any means. We've just seen the elections in Austria, the regional elections in Germany, and just about all over Europe, the same phenomena can be observed. I think I heard that there were 20 countries within the European Union where the extreme right parties picked up more than 20% of the vote in the European elections. So it's an international trend, and not even limited to Europe, because we've got the phenomena of Trump and Putin and so on in other parts of the world. And, that's something which needs to be looked at. What is the explanation for this development, which in France has led to the situation where I hope it's not going to be the case, but it's certainly a strong possibility that Le Pen could win, or Le Pen's party could win, the next presidential elections in this country. The backdrop to this rise in nationalism, economic stagnation, which goes back before the COVID crisis. France hasn't really reached the kind of levels of production and, economic viability that it had before the COVID crisis. Falling living standards, which was the case before the recent, over the last couple of years, the kind of sharp rise in inflation. But even before that, living standards generally were declining. That is to say, the means by which people had to, feed their families, pay their rent, pay basic expenses. Life was getting increasingly difficult. So you've got, falling living standards, economic stagnation, a sort of generalization of what we call precarious labor contracts here. That is to say, short-term, underpaid, insecure labor contracts. And things like the European Union. At the time of the Maastricht Treaty and the kind of successive stages in the building up of the European Union, the argument was that if Europe was united within a single customs union, then that would lead to rising living standards, peace, prosperity, an end to mass unemployment. And there was even this idea that there'd be a sort of a peace dividend, because Europe would be a force for peace in the world. And this peace dividend would mean more money for health, more money for public services, and, more money for affordable housing and so on. And the reality has been the exact opposite. There's been this increase over recent years of tensions between the different nation states within the European Union. Obviously, there's the Brexit phenomena, which was an expression of that. You've got, as I say, economic stagnation, declining living standards. And so millions of people in Europe and in France feel threatened, they feel vulnerable, and, they're worried about the future for themselves and for their children. And so what we have here is, it shouldn't really surprise us, this growth of nationalist reaction, because in a way it's a reaction against globalization, or what you might call capitalist internationalism, free trade on a world scale, goods and movements of, labor and merchandise, capital transfers all over the world on an unprecedented scale. It's just the general feeling among the population that nobody controls anything anymore, and that their livelihoods and the quality of life they have is subject to forces which go way beyond the boundaries of their own country, and which, as I say, nobody is really controlling. And so it's not surprising that you've got this backlash against this in popular consciousness of saying, they might not formulate it in these words exactly, but what it means is, let's bring things back under control of our own governments. Let's have governments that are free from the influence of international trade magnates and, the pressures of the world economy. Let's get control back of our frontiers so that our industries are not swept away by foreign competition and our wages and conditions are not undermined by migrant labor, as the perception is. And therefore, there's a kind of desire to, as I say, bring things under the control of smaller units where governments no longer have this excuse of international factors or the European Union or world trade or decisions taken in Washington or Tokyo to justify what is happening in the country. So I think that those are the mainsprings of this rise in nationalist ideology and a sort of nationalist reflex with its component of, resentment and hostility towards what are considered as foreigners and people who shouldn't really be here for one reason or another. To put it in a nutshell, if there's not enough housing for everybody, or there's not enough affordable housing, if there aren't enough jobs or decent jobs for everybody, if there aren't enough beds in hospitals, if there aren't enough places in nurseries, and so on, then some will have and some will not have. And therefore, it's only one step from that, if there's no other alternative, to say, well, we're French. We, are the real French, and we should have some sort of priority in the distribution of these factors in the quality of life. And so that really, this idea of national priority is the underpinning idea of this, rise in nationalistic and, anti-migrant racist sentiment. So, as I say, it's not really surprising. It's a result of the failure of capitalist globalization on a national and international scale. There's a good side to this, because if you're not careful, you can get sucked into a sort of real pessimism when you see, these racist parties rising up everywhere. And it seems that, the extreme right are stridently pushing their way into the corridors of power all over the country and internationally. But there is a good side to what is happening now, in a way, because this development has really alarmed and sort of awakened, tens of thousands of youth who are starting to get organized, not necessarily in the traditional workers' organizations, although that is also true to some extent, but are getting organized through, social media, through local associations. There's a kind of a reaction and a desire to fight against this racist and nationalist threat. Recently, I was at the Fête de l'Humanité, which is a big festival organized every year by the French Communist Party, where, hundreds of thousands of people show up to this festival. And you could actually feel it during the event that, there'd been a kind of galvanization of the left in order to face up to this growing threat from the right. And after all, the Popular Front, when it was formed, how was it that these leaders who'd been squabbling for many years suddenly came to an agreement that they needed some sort of left alliance to face up to the pressure from the extreme right? The pressure came from the rank and file of those parties and from the electorate. It came from sort of left public opinion that this has to stop, and we need to have some sort of fighting apparatus capable of countering the rise of the right. So I think that's a very encouraging sign, and that's something which we have to build on in the future. Now, of course, the Popular Front, the New Popular Front, is a deliberate reference to the Popular Front which came to power in 1936 in the interwar years. And there are similarities between the two situations. Like the present Popular Front, the Popular Front in 1936 was formed through, alarm and consciousness of the danger from the fascist and monarchist leagues who 2 years earlier in 1934 had actually tried to storm the parliament and take control of the national parliament. And also, there was the particular international context of the time when Hitler in power just across the border in Germany. But there are also differences. One of the differences is that international context. We don't have Hitler and Mussolini in power, fortunately, today. But there are differences in that the Popular Front of 1936 was actually a coalition between the right and the left. One of the biggest components of the Popular Front was the Radical Party, which was, you could say, the main party of big business in France at the time. And therefore, its policy was extremely limited. The socialist and communist leaders at the time obstinately refused to include in the program of the Popular Front of 36 any measures or any sort of promises which would scare away the radicals, as they said. And because the radicals were a conservative party, despite their name, looking after the interests of big business, that didn't really leave much you could put in the program of the Popular Front that was of any real interest to the working class. People associate the Popular Front of 36 with the introduction of paid holidays, wage increases, improvements in workers' rights and workers' living conditions. But in fact, those were not the consequence of the Popular Front government, but the consequence of the general strike of 1936, which took place before the government even was set up. It was the general strike took place in the period between elections and the formation of the government. And the concessions which were made were concessions to the general strike and not sort of spontaneous measures taken by the Popular Front. So we don't have that today. So the present day Popular Front doesn't include any openly capitalist parties. However, there are marked differences in the political makeup of the different components of the Popular Front. When Macron basically engineered a split in the Socialist Party before he came to power, he sort of sucked out of the Socialist Party many of the most outrageously right-wing elements. And the rump of the Socialist Party, which was left, was basically the left of the Socialist Party. And so the Socialist Party's policy has generally moved to the left since then, but that not all the right-wingers went with Macron. And for instance, while Macron was considering what kind of prime minister he would name for this new government and what the composition of the new government should be, the right wing of the Socialist Party were openly playing for positions in the government. And they would say things like, a Popular Front government wouldn't be a good idea because it would stimulate movements in the streets, which would lead to institutional instability and chaos. We could work with Macron if he made a few gestures to justify our participation in a right-wing government. And, they were basically putting themselves forward as candidates for a Macron ministry. That right-wing element in the Socialist Party is hostile to collaboration with France Insoumise or with the Communist Party. And basically they want the Popular Front to break up. So there's that, there's no radical party, there's no openly capitalist party, but it's as if it's pretty similar to that in a way, because we do have this clearly pro-capitalist element of the Socialist Party, which, while being nominally in the Popular Front, is hostile to it and is doing whatever it can to sabotage it or to impose right-wing policies upon it. So the program of the new Popular Front is to the left, actually, of the Popular Front of 1936. It calls for significant increases in wages, the abolition of the counter reforms in terms of pensions, for a massive development and extension of public services. As I say, wage increases, improvements in the labor laws, the abrogation of a lot of the reactionary legislation under Macron and previous governments. So it's a positive program which we should support, which we do support. But unfortunately, neither the communist leaders nor the France Insoumise leadership, and even less the Socialist Party leadership, they haven't really learned anything of the fundamental lessons of previous left governments and left parties. Recently, last year, there was a debate between the leader of the MEDEF, which is the equivalent of the British CBI, if it's still called the CBI in Britain, I'm not sure. The bosses' confederation, basically. The leader of the MEDEF was in a debate with Mélenchon, the leader of France Insoumise. And to summarize what went on in this discussion, it was basically this. The leader of the Capitalist Federation, he says, listen, your policy is completely unrealistic. You want to tax big corporations. You want to tax the rich. You want to tax profits to a very, serious degree. And that will have very negative consequences, because if you tax the rich, if you increase wages, if you take all these measures against the rich, which is in your program, then basically investment will stop. The economy will grind to a halt. Unemployment will go up. Capital will leave the country. So your policy is not practical. Now, that's a very significant argument to which Mélenchon had no answer except to say he couldn't believe that the bosses in France would sabotage their own economy to that degree. Well, he should believe it, because when the Mitterrand government came in 1981, that was a government which had a pretty radical and far-reaching program of social reform. It reduced the working week, it increased the minimum wage, it improved the arrangements for pensions, it introduced new labor laws favorable to the unions. It carried out a whole avalanche, really, of social reform in favor of the working people. But within 6 months, it was forced to abandon that program, and not only to abandon it, but actually to start doing the opposite. They introduced a wage freeze and started dismantling state-owned industries like steel and coal, and basically working against the interests of the working people. Why did they do that? People call them traitors and renegades and so on. Well, there's an argument for that, but there were strong, material reasons which pushed them in that direction. And what was happening was a massive flight of capital outside the country, a collapse in investment in the economy. It was called an investment strike at the time. And basically, because they didn't have the perspective of, taking over industry and nationalizing on a much greater scale than they had done. By the way, they nationalized all the banks, and the public sector in industry represented something like 22% of industry after the nationalizations of the Mitterrand government, but it wasn't enough. And so basically they were forced to backtrack by the backlash from capitalist interests, in order to force this left government to abandon its policies and adopt policies in the interests of the capitalists. And what the leader of the MEDEF is saying today is basically that will happen again. So, what is the answer to that? This is where, we are critical of the sort of limited reformist policies of the left and of the New Popular Front, in that, they have all these very good, positive demands, which would, nominally at least, or on the face of it, would improve the conditions of working people. So it's something very positive. But they don't foresee any measures to disarm big business and the capitalist class in the face of the inevitable backlash, reaction by them to force a government to abandon this kind of progressive policy. And so, what we would say is, I mean, I don't think like some people do, they go around waving flags, revolution, revolution, revolution. That doesn't really resonate with working people if it's just put forward like that. But, we need to post things in a kind of practical and insightful manner as to how social reforms can not only be applied, but can also be consolidated and kept. And, what we should explain is that, yes, we're in favor of increased wages, of increased taxes on the rich, of nationalizations, of developing the public services, and so on and so forth, reduction of the working week. But we know how the other side will react to that. And if they do react in that way, then the only way to conserve this policy, to continue with this policy of social reform and improvements in living standards, is to take decisive measures to prevent, to take from the capitalist class the economic power which enables to conduct that kind of sabotage. I think if things were explained patiently, with examples from history and with, developing the argument, a lot of workers would be convinced by that kind of policy, and that would overcome a lot of the skepticism in relation to the left because of its past failures, because it was actually learned the lessons of those previous experiences. I'd just like to deal with one other aspect of what's going on in France, and that is that it's not just about nationalism and, anti-migrant racist sentiment, but it's also that one aspect of these growing trends is growing indulgence or acceptance of authoritarian politics. Now, here again, the left falls short in its argument, because what it does is it counterposes the republic to authoritarianism or, dictatorial behavior. And, that doesn't cut a lot of ice, because a lot of people, and possibly even most people, they think that democracy doesn't represent them, that we have these elections, that we put people into parliament, we put people into power, but then they don't behave in our interests. They don't carry out measures in our interests. They feather their own nests. A lot of them are corrupt. And, basically the system is not working for us, the people down below. And this is a very old issue, by the way, in politics in France and, in a lot of other places. Even before the French Revolution, the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he was talking about Britain, and he said, this was under the monarchy. He said, the British, they think they've got a control over their government, but they haven't. He didn't like the term representative democracy, because he said any people that names representatives for itself basically loses power. And he preferred the terms, people who are mandated by the population to carry out policies in their interests. Then we had the French Revolution, where, at the height of the French Revolution, the sans-culottes, or the kind of popular masses at the height of the French Revolution, they would they refused this idea of representative politics, and they wanted people who were came out of the people, who were lived like the people, had similar living standards to the people, and were devoted to the people's cause. And they insisted that anyone who was put in an elected position who seemed to be, shaky or unreliable, or doing the opposite of what they were supposed to do, then they should be able to be recalled. And the most well-known example, perhaps, on the left is the Paris Commune, where they said anyone who claims to represent the people should live like the people and should be subject to immediate recall if ever they lose the favor of the people. So this is an old discussion, but, the truth of the matter is that parliamentary democracy doesn't represent the people. And, it's these parliaments all over Europe, who are they actually fighting for? The politicians are fighting for themselves or for the interests of big business, and they make all these fancy promises in order to get elected. And this is an idea which is widely shared in the population. And so the appeals to, Parliament and the institutions and the Republic and so on it's a relatively limited value. There again, what we need is to argue the case for a new republic, a republic which is not, run by professional politicians and bureaucrats, but a republic which is in the service of ordinary working people and whose personnel is made up of people, like us and directly elected and recallable by the people. So, we need to find a way of formulating this need for a change in regime in order to convince people that, a new left government will not just be like the previous left governments, and there will be a radical change. Because what's really helping the extreme right at the present time is that in the eyes of a lot of workers, and, unfortunately, it is, a considerable section now of the working class who are voting for these people. In the eyes of the workers, they want change. They want something radical to occur, a break with the past. They want things to move in the opposite direction to what they are now. And the Rassemblement National, the extreme right, seem to represent that radical change. And so, if the left are to defeat nationalism, it has to put forward a policy which will convince people that when they come to power, there'll be a radical break with the past.